There's a dangerous myth we tell ourselves about the fall of empires. That collapse is slow, predictable, and gentle. But history gives us a very different answer. Collapses are fast, violent, and psychologically impossible for citizens to accept while they're happening. Rome ruled a continent for 5 centuries. It controlled 60 million people. It built roads across the world and called the Mediterranean our sea, him. Yet the moment its reputation cracked, the city was burning 3 days later. France had the strongest military in Europe in 1940. Generals boasted of how Germany would break itself against the Maginot Line. A month and a half later, German tanks were rolling through Paris. 4 weeks turned a superpower into an occupied territory. The Soviet Union was a nuclear giant with the biggest army on the planet. It terrified the world for 45 years. But in 900 days from the Berlin Wall falling to Gorbachev resigning, the superpower simply ceased to exist. 3 collapses, 3 different continents, 3 different systems, and yet the same structure, one-eyed. Decades of invisible internal decline, 2-1. A sudden public shock that breaks confidence, 3 Mayans. A cascade that accelerates until the empire is gone. That's the pattern. And that pattern is now pointing directly at the United States. For 80 years, America has been the center of the global system. Strongest military, reserve currency, cultural dominance, unmatched alliances. But all empires look invincible, right until the day they aren't. This isn't about predicting collapse. It's about understanding the mechanics and the timeline. The United States has already completed Phase 1. Phase dos has begun. Once Phase 3 starts, the clock runs fast, not in decades, but in days, weeks, and months. The only question that matters now, when does confidence break? Because once it does, the countdown begins. Collapse never begins with chaos. It begins with comfort. Phase 1 is the illusion of stability. On the surface, the empire looks strong, maybe even stronger than ever. The military still dominates headlines. The currency still rules global trade. The economy still grows, even if artificially. Politicians assure the public that everything is fine, and people believe it, because the alternative is too frightening to imagine. Rome, in the late 300 seconds, still called itself eternal. It still minted coins with emperors celebrating victory. But inside the empire, recruitment was failing. Gold reserves were running dry. Provincial loyalty was collapsing. Yet Rome insisted, nothing has changed. France, in the 1,930 seconds, still celebrated World War I victory. Generals swore the Maginot Line was unbreakable. But behind the parades, doctrine was outdated. Command was sluggish. Morale was fragile. Still, everyone said, Germany would never dare. The Soviet Union in the 1,980 seconds still boasted of communism's triumph. It launched the Olympics, sent astronauts into space, and displayed missiles in Red Square. But beneath the propaganda, factories were decaying, food shortages spread, debt exploding, and the Kremlin repeated, "We are strong forever." The United States has lived in this phase for nearly 2 decades. Trillions in debt, but we can print more. Wars lost, but our military is the best. Political division, but democracy always fixes itself. Supply chains outsourced, but globalization saves us money. Every warning sign is brushed aside. Every structural crack explained away. Every crisis treated as temporary. Because denial is the fuel of decline. Empires rarely fall because enemies defeat them. They fall because leaders convince themselves that losing is impossible. Phase 1 ends the moment something happens that no one can explain away, a moment when the reputation that held everything together suddenly breaks. That is the transition into Phase 2. And America has already crossed that line. This is the moment every empire fears, the moment the myth dies. For decades, the reputation of power carries a nation. People don't question it. Enemy don't test it. Allies trust it blindly. Then, one event exposes the truth. One defeat. One crisis. One humiliation. And suddenly the entire world sees the empire as it actually is, not as it pretended to be. Rome's moment Adrianople, 378 AD. The legions had been unstoppable for 400 years. But against the Goths, Rome suffered a defeat it should have easily avoided. An emperor killed, elite forces annihilated. For the first time, the unthinkable became real. Rome could lose. That single battle shattered centuries of fear and respect. To France's moment. June 1794. The Maginot Line was supposed to be invincible. The French army was the largest in Europe. Then Germany bypassed the forts and broke the nation in 6 weeks. The collapse wasn't just military, it was psychological. France didn't surrender because it was weak. France surrendered because it realized it was weak. USSR's moment Afghanistan, 1989. The Red Army had crushed rebellions across an empire. But after 10 years of fighting farmers with rifles, it lost. The Soviets didn't just lose a war, they lost the illusion of superpower status. And within 900 days, their entire empire evaporated. America's moment. Kabul Airport, August 1991. 20 years. Trillions spent. The most advanced military in history, defeated by an insurgency. With no air force, no nave, no satellites. The world watched chaos unfold live. Afghans clinging to aircraft. Soldiers killed at the gate. Billions in US weapons abandoned. Taliban posing with American gear. China watched. Russia watched. Iran watched. Allies watched too. And for the first time in 80 years, they asked, what if America can't protect us? That is a credibility break. Not because America lost a war, but because the illusion of automatic victory died. And once an empire loses its reputation, the cascade begins. This is where collapse turns visible. Phase 3 is the acceleration. The moment cracks become fractures, and fractures become a freefall. Once confidence breaks, the empire loses the one thing that makes power sustainable. Belief. Belief that the currency holds value. Belief that the military can defend allies. Belief that institutions still function. Belief that tomorrow will look like yesterday. When belief collapses, everything collapses. Not gradually, exponentially. How the cascade unfolded in history. Rome. After the sack of 410 AD, the message was clear. If Rome can burn, no city is safe. Provinces stopped paying taxes. Armies stopped obeying orders. Neighbors and former allies tested borders. The empire crumbled faster than it could respond. France. Once Paris fell, commanders across the country simply gave up. Whole divisions surrendered. The state disintegrated before German tanks even reached them. The army still existed on paper, but not in reality. USSR. Once Eastern Europe broke free, the satellite states collapsed like dominoes. Then the Soviet republics followed. The center collapsed last because it realized too late that it no longer controlled anything. That is how cascades work. Collapse moves from the edges to the center and arrives there suddenly. America has entered the early cascade. Look around. Ali quietly hedging. Saudis deal with China. India balances Moscow and Washington. Europe questions US. Security guarantees. Currency, confidence, weakening. Dollar share of reserves falling fast. BRICS building parallel systems. Oil trade shifting to yuan. Domestic trust breaking. Elections disputed. Supreme Court delegitimized. Congress viewed as dysfunctional. Social cohesion fracturing. Crime surging. Political violence rising. Red versus blue becoming irreconcilable nations. None of this resolves itself. Because once doubt enters the system, doubt spreads everywhere. The psychology of the cascade. Collapse becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. People lose trust. They pull money, withdraw support. Institutions weaken. Collapse accelerates. More people lose trust. Confidence drops faster than any government can react. That's why no empire has ever reversed. Phase 3. By the time the cascade starts, the empire is already falling. This is the phase where the map changes, where the empire that once controlled everything can no longer control itself. Power stops flowing from the center. It begins flowing outward to regions, governors, militias, corporations, anyone who can provide security better than the state. That's when a nation stops being one country and becomes a collection of territories with different futures. In Rome's shattering, after the sack of 410 AD, provincial leaders asked a simple question: why obey a capital that can't protect itself? Gaul, Spain, and North Africa stopped sending taxes. Generals turned into warlords. The empire dissolved piece by piece long before the final date of 476 AD. The Roman Empire died regionally first, France's disappearance. France didn't just lose, it changed governments overnight. The legitimate French state fled south and became a puppet. The resistance formed its own power centers. Local authorities answered to whoever had guns: Germans, collaborators, or partisans. Paris was France no longer. Soviet disunion. The USSR's collapse wasn't Moscow falling, it was everywhere else leaving. Lithuania, gone. Ukraine, gone. Georgia, gone. Kazakhstan, gone. Moscow woke up one morning and discovered it no longer had a country. It didn't collapse. It fragmented. America's brewing fragmentation. The United States is beginning to exhibit exactly the same fault lines: states nullifying federal policies, local sheriffs refusing federal authority, sanctuary states and 2-ampere states ignoring Washington, regional alliances forming West Coast Bloc, Southern Bloc. Talk of secession goes mainstream. This is how fragmentation starts. Not with a declaration, but with non-compliance. The question isn't, will the U.S. break apart? The real question is, which region secedes first and why? What comes next? In Phase 4, legitimacy is contested. Who is the real government? Who has the right to enforce laws? Who controls the military? Who commands loyalty? When a nation can't answer those questions, it's no longer a nation. Fragmentation isn't the end of collapse. It's the beginning of the end. This is the moment collapse stops being a headline and becomes your daily life. Phase 5 is when systems fail simultaneously. Currency, law, safety, infrastructure. Everything you depended on stops working at once, and suddenly survival becomes the only priority. Look at history. When Rome entered freefall, coins were worthless. People hoarded food instead of money. Roads became dangerous. Cities emptied as citizens fled into the countryside. There was no empire to protect them, only hunger, disease, and fear. In France, from 1940 to 1944, order collapsed under occupation. Collaboration, resistance, black markets. Loyalty became a life and death calculation. What mattered wasn't citizenship, it was which side could keep you alive. In the Soviet freefall of the 1,990 seconds, the currency evaporated. Pension disappeared. Police weren't paid. Mafia groups replaced the state. People traded goods on the street just to survive the week. The superpower had become a playground for criminals overnight. Now imagine that in the United States, Phase 5 for America begins when the dollar breaks. You wake up, and your money is worth half as much as yesterday. Groceries cost triple. Gas is unaffordable. Your paycheck can't keep up with prices if you still even have a job. Banks freeze withdrawals. Business shut down. Imports vanish from shelves. Because the world no longer accepts your currency. Crime becomes a daily threat. Police can't respond, they're understaffed, underpaid, overwhelmed. Emergency services collapse first. People start defending their own neighborhoods. Wealthy districts hire private militarized security. Everyone else is left on their own. Your power goes out for hours, then days. Roads crumble, and no one repairs them. Hospitals overcrowd as medicine shortages spread. The social contract dissolves. Not by a vote, but by necessity. And here's the most disturbing truth. Free fall always arrives faster than the human mind can accept. 1 week you're living your normal life work. School, restaurants. The next week, you're calculating how long your food and fuel will last. A collapsing empire doesn't tell you that it's collapsing. It tells you everything is fine, until the moment you can't eat. And then comes the final phase. The part of collapse that can't be undone. The reset. Because no empire enters Phase 6 and remains the same empire afterward. History proves it. The only question left is, what does the American reset look like? And who survives it? Every collapse ends with a reset. But the reset is not recovery. It is rebirth through destruction. When an empire reaches Phase 6, and the old system is finished, its institutions are illegitimate, its currency is dead, its military is fractured, its borders are negotiable, what emerges next is not a repaired empire, but a different country entirely. Rome's reset created medieval Europe, a patchwork of kingdoms replacing a unified empire. The technology regressed. Trade collapsed. Knowledge scattered. It took centuries for Europe to rebuild what Rome lost in a generation. France's reset came through foreign liberation. Americans and British soldiers restored the land, but France never again led the world. It went from empire to former empire in the span of one war. The Soviet reset turned one giant nation into 15 separate countries. Russia survived, but it became poorer, weaker, a shadow of the USSR's ambitions. That is the nature of the reset. You lose what made you great, and you start again from below. So what does the American reset look like? There are 3 realistic pathways, and none lead back to the world we know now. 2. Path 1. The fragmented union. The United States survives in name only, but regional governments take primary control. Texas acts like a country. California acts like a country. The federal government remains, but largely as a symbolic structure. Think the European Union, but with deeper distrust and armed borders within. 2. The authoritarian stabilizer. In chaos, people trade freedom for security. A strong figure or faction restores order with harsh measures. Dissent is crushed. Power is centralized. The Constitution becomes a historical document, not a governing one. This happened in Rome under Diocletian. It can happen anywhere. 8. Path 3. Global power transfer. America retreats to its domestic core. International leadership shifts, most likely to China. Bases close. Alliances dissolvent. The dollar loses reserve status. The world enters a new age, one without an American guarantee of stability. Trade routes become battlegrounds again. Small conflicts ignite into larger wars. Because the referee has left the game. Reality check. Every reset ends the same way. The empire disappears. The people adjust. The world becomes more dangerous. The catastrophic truth? Most citizens won't understand that the reset has already begun until they're living inside it. And then they'll ask, how did we get here so fast? The answer is simple. Collapse is slow until the day it isn't. To understand the danger, we need to understand the clock. Not the decades of slow decline we have already lived through, but the speed of the final drop. Because once the credibility of an empire breaks, time compresses. Centuries of power can vanish inside a single season. Rome collapsed in only 3 days of shock inside the capital. But the critical damage was done the moment citizens realized the legions could no longer protect them. Confidence died first. The empire followed. France fell in 6 weeks. German divisions did not destroy the entire French army. The French people simply stopped believing they could win. Officers surrendered before battles were even fought. The Soviet Union disintegrated in 900 days, not because it ran out of bombs or tanks, but because the republics realized Moscow had lost the authority to command them. The political glue dissolved. The map changed overnight. This is the collapse timeline pattern. Belief breaks. Systems lock up. The center loses control. Regions act independently. The empire ends. The length of the final collapse is determined by 2 forces. A. How quickly the public understands that the government cannot protect them. B. How rapidly systems like currency and food supply fail once confidence disappears. The United States is far more interconnected and digital than Rome, France, or the USSR ever were. Money moves instantly. Panic spreads instantly. Markets react instantly. A bank failure in one state triggers runs nationwide. A military defeat in the Pacific shifts alliances in hours. A political crisis in Washington freezes the entire legal system. That means the American version of the final collapse will be faster than all 3 examples combined. Not centuries like Rome, not weeks like France, not years like the USSR. A realistic window is 18 to 36 months from trigger event to fragmentation. If the trigger is a military failure, the clock starts the moment allies lose faith in American protection. If the trigger is a financial crisis, the clock starts the moment foreign buyers dump dollars. If the trigger is political breakdown, the clock starts the moment states refuse federal authority. And once that countdown begins, there is no pause button. People will still be going to work, still scrolling their phones, still believing everything is temporary, until the day their bank card stops working and their government cannot fix it. The fall does not feel like collapse. It feels like sudden paralysis. One morning you wake up and the systems that held your life together simply fail. That is how fast the end arrives. And most people will only understand what happened after it is over. Most people imagine collapse as something cinematic. Explosions, invasions, dramatic announcements. But real collapse feels different. It feels confusing. It feels unbelievable. It feels like normal life is still happening even as everything important stops working. In Rome, people did not wake up expecting their city to burn. They expected trade to resume, wages to return, grain shipments to arrive. They believed the empire would fix the crisis. Then the gates opened, and the world they knew was gone. In France, citizens packed cars with suitcases and children and drove south as roads jammed and bombs fell. They left homes unlocked, expecting to return in a few days. Many never did. They did not think they were living through the end of France. They thought it was a temporary setback. In the Soviet Union, employees kept going to factories long after salaries were worthless. Stores had empty shelves, but people still stood in line because they could not accept that the system was finished. They waited for the government to restore stability. It never did. That is the emotional reality of collapse. You still go to work, you still pay bills, you still make plans, until the moment everything stops and you realize that the world you trusted is gone. For Americans, life inside collapse will look like this. Your bank limits cash withdrawals. You tell yourself it is temporary. Grocery shelves grow thinner each week. You blame supply issues. Crime rises, but you tell yourself the police will handle it. The dollar falls, but you believe the government will stabilize it. Protests grow, but you insist democracy will solve the division. Every sign is visible. None feel final. Because the mind refuses to accept that something so familiar can disappear. Then the breaking point arrives. Maybe it is a major military failure overseas. Maybe it is a financial shock the government cannot contain. Maybe cities erupt in unrest and the federal government loses authority. Suddenly, your job, your savings, your home, your public services, your sense of safety are all in question. You look around and realize that society has been running on trust and confidence is gone. People do not panic right away. Panic comes later. First comes disbelief, then confusion, then survival. And in that moment, the empire is already over, even if nobody has announced it yet. Every empire reaches a moment when the future divides. One path leads to renewal and survival. The other leads to permanent decline. The United States is approaching that moment now. The decisions made in the coming years will determine whether the country becomes a stronger version of itself or a lesson future civilizations study as a warning. History shows us three outcomes. The first is fragmentation. The center fails. States take power. Regional identities harden. Loyalty shifts from the nation to the local authority that can still provide safety, food, stability. The empire continues in name only, while real power is carved into competing zones. This is the Roman path. The second is foreign dependency. A defeated or weakened nation becomes subordinate to external powers. It still exists, but under the terms of others. Its influence fades. Its sovereignty becomes negotiable. Its history becomes a story of what it used to be. This is the French path. The third is authoritarian stabilization. A single force seizes control to restore order. Freedoms shrink. Dissent becomes dangerous. The state survives, but the republic does not. People gain security but lose the system they believed was permanent. This is the Soviet path after the collapse. The question for the United States is simple. When systems fail, who will Americans turn to for authority? The federal government, state governments, military factions, corporations that control information and infrastructure, or themselves? The strength of America has always been its belief in a shared identity. One nation, one destiny. But identity is fragile when economic stability breaks and trust dies. In collapse, people do not rally around ideals. They rally around what keeps them alive. There are still ways out, but they require something no empire in denial has ever done willingly. Admitting the decline is real, reducing commitments abroad, restoring financial discipline, rebuilding domestic production, repairing institutional legitimacy, and, hardest of all, rebuilding trust between citizens who no longer believe in the same country. Will America make those choices? Will leaders sacrifice power to avoid collapse? Will citizens accept the pain required to fix what is broken? Will anyone in charge say the truth out loud before the crisis forces it? Empires do not fall because they are conquered. They fall because they cannot change in time. The clock is already running. The 6 phases are in motion. The only question left is whether Americans recognize the moment they are living in, whether they understand that history is not something in books. It is what you live through without realizing it. Rome fell in 3 days. France in 6 weeks. The USSR in 900 days. What will the American timeline be? And, more importantly, who will be ready when the countdown reaches 0?